People share the dark family secrets they've learned.
My dad's sister had a secret daughter that would have been approximately his age. She was 16 years older than him, and the family didn't tell him until he was in college. In their small town, there is not zero chance he could have / did date his niece.
My grandfather got out of serving in Vietnam by robbing pharmacies and going to jail for years.
Grandma didn't decide to move in with us because she loved us so much and wanted to spend more time with us. Grandma moved in because her son was a meth addict and convinced her to put his name on the house, take all the money out of it for renovations, and leave her homeless. She had a heart attack the night she found out and now has to live with a pacemaker. Screw you, Uncle Roy.
Got a Facebook message from one guy asking if I was related to my dad, since it's not a common last name. I thought he was a fan of his work, because I was in college at the time and the guy was about the same age as me. And that's how I found out my dad slept around and that I had a half-brother the same age as me.
Great-grandpa was a soldier opposing the Axis powers. Him and his squad were caught by Italian troops and given the death penalty along with his friends. They would be executed together. At the time of the execution all of his mates died in front of his eyes, but he survived because the soldier missed. Without skipping a beat he faked his death by, well, lying on top of his deceased friends' bodies. Surprisingly it worked and he got to escape.
My father got my mother pregnant when he was her teacher in high school. He was 30 and married. She was 15 and his student. They ran off together, he got a divorce, and they got married in a state that allowed marriage at 16, 2 months before my older brother was born.
My dad is in a cult. Wasn't much of a secret, but as a kid you just kinda assume everything your parents do is the norm.
That my favorite cousin wasn't missing. All I knew growing up, he was 13 years older than me, was that he would come and go a lot. He lived with us when I was a baby and after he moved out he would visit every 6 months or so out of the blue. But we never visited him or called him. His visits were one of my favorite things in the world. I loved him like a brother. By the time I was a teenager I did understand that he had issues with his parents. They had kicked him out at 13 and my parents took him in. But that kind of childhood messes with you. In between visits to my parents he avoided the rest of the family, moved a lot, and didn't hold jobs for long, which is why my parents didn't always know where he was. But in my later teens he stopped coming over at all. I asked repeatedly if anyone had heard from him and I was told no. I asked about contacting him and was told no one had a number or address for him. He would come around when he felt like it. But it stretched on for years. I really worried he was dead, and I really missed him. In my late 20s I finally found out that everyone knew where he was the whole time. He was in prison for murder. From what I hear it was actually somewhat justified. He was defending his new wife, who I never got to meet. I also found out some super shitty things about how the extended family sided with his messed up parents and refused to help him or his wife when he got arrested, and that they shamed my dad into not helping either. I tried to send a message to him in prison but I don't know if he ever got it. I wish he knew that I didn't turn my back on him for decades like everyone else did. I just didn't know.
Not so much let in on, as we found out by accident, but apparently my dad's first love and him got into a serious car crash when he was 25 and she died. He lived with her father for years after her death. He still occasionally comes to visit my dad, even 30 years later. We were always told he was a mentor until my sister pressed my mom on the subject. One of my sisters is even named after the girl that died, middle name, and we never even knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought it up with him. My dad used to send me birthday cards every year when I was a young girl. My mother left my dad while pregnant with me for good reason. Even though I never got to meet him when I was young, I was glad to still receive a card from him with a few bucks acknowledging I was alive and that he did one day want to see me. Around 14 to 15 I learned that my mother had written every single one of those letters and my grandfather would mail it to ourselves to make it seem legit. I never ever actually received any letter from him.
When my grandfather died, he wrote his will on his deathbed. He left his entire estate to my family, which was enormous. His wife, however, who despised us, in the biggest screw you move I've ever seen, wrote a directly conflicting will, leaving the estate to her family, none of whom I've ever met, and then killed herself. It took around 5 years in legal hell to sort that out. We ended up winning the case in the end, but it cost so much that we couldn't afford to keep his $3 million house anymore.
My grandma actually legally disowned my mother for marrying my dad. The family house was supposed to go to my mom, but after the disowning, Grandma didn't say who she wanted the house to go to, resulting in a decades-long family feud that has split the family even to this day. Sad thing is, my parents actually ended up divorced after 20 years of marriage. Mom took care of my grandma till the end and was the one who handled the funeral arrangements when my grandma passed 2 years ago. She never asked for the house back. It's worth millions. Nobody told me any of this until I was 30.
When I was young I thought it was really nice that my Nana lived with my aunt and her family since she was getting on a bit and it meant she was looked after and there were always people around. Aunt has 6 kids. Occasionally Aunt would gripe about being the one looking after Nana since Aunt is also one of many kids and being young I sympathized, but given they all spent loads of time with Nana too, didn't think it was a big deal. You don't think about financial responsibility when you're young, I think, just social and caring. Well, it turns out the reason Nana lives with Aunt is because Aunt and her husband convinced Nana to put the house in their name so they could look after her affairs and sold it out from under her and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it's gone now. Because of this her siblings refuse to give Aunt a penny towards looking after Nana since it's her fault Nana has no money or assets and instead pay to take Nana out all the time, meals, shopping, activities, so she doesn't go without, but they let Aunt struggle under the weight of Nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now, so they are not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back at her griping with annoyance and think what a terrible person she is.
My aunt started the Communist Party in her country. It got quite large, her children fled the country, and I still don't know what happened to her.
My step-grandfather has always been an alcoholic. As a child he even taught me how to mix his favorite drink. As a kid at like 6 years old I would mix his drink as he liked and bring it into him in the living room. Don't ask what the drink was a mix of cause I literally can't remember, and my grandpa always acted funny. I always liked spending time with him cause I found him funny. So I never saw the bad side of his alcoholism and he never made me drink or anything, so overall he didn't have any negative impact on me at all. But before I was born he could get so drunk he threatened to kill my grandma, and when he got in a car accident and came home he was bleeding badly from his head and he started saying my granny shot him. He even threw out some of the wedding pictures my parents had. I never knew how horrible he was. Maybe cause he liked kids or something. He would make me cocoa and watch Garfield with me when I was a kid. He was never a bad influence in my life. So it was so weird to me when I found out these things about him. Before he died though, he really regretted drinking, and he completely stopped. He became really depressed too until his granddaughter, biological, was born. He was so happy about his granddaughter. He died regretting everything and a sober man who was happy to have been able to meet his one and only biological granddaughter. Regardless of everything he really changed in the end and everyone was really upset he died.
I always thought my Uncle Dan died in a car accident. Turned out he owed a lot of money to a loan shark. He and his partner were asked to play Russian roulette and the one who survives can walk away and get an extension for payment. Uncle wasn't lucky.
My grandfather killed his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money and all worked to support their families. If they got arrested they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income. So they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to war, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled, and it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say they swerved to miss a kangaroo, and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 kilometers per hour, enough to be serious. A broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seatbelts. And nobody found them or their car for an hour or so. And nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother and I until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a route, and called it a tragedy.
I was never told much, but when I was about 15 my grandmother started getting dementia and had a breakdown. All I could understand was that she kept repeating, "We are traitors." I know she was sent to some sort of children's camp during World War II to be away from the fighting. I think it was called Kinderland. I believe she never saw her parents again and it took decades to find her sister. I will have to ask my aunt one day. Maybe she can tell me more.
Great-grandpa was a fascist and got a death sentence, later life in prison, later reduced. It's debatable how fair it was. The other great-grandpa was shot dead by some man in front of his son, my grandpa, who would have gotten killed too but started running and managed to get out, only getting shot in the arm. His mom knew who was behind the murder but refused to tell him and his brother so that they don't get revenge, and she didn't tell them until her death. Great-grandma read tarot cards for a regional political figure during an important political decision, though I think her role might be overly exaggerated by our family, so I'd rather not give the details. Grandma's brother was adored by a famous female poet, but was gay and murdered by his lover. This was really a secret because his mom was very religious, so my family only found out later. My grandma loved him a lot too and never fully got over his death. My grandpa was a good actor and was allegedly offered projects in Hollywood, but he turned it down because he thought people were too gay. His brother though had minor roles in some minor movies, carried a gun around and acted like a celebrity. Some of this sounds almost made up, but I think those were just interesting times to be alive.
My cousins lived with us for a while and we thought that was fun because it's like a sleepover every day. One time our mom even took us out of school to pick them up. I learned later that it was because Child Protective Services took my cousins away from their mom because of mental health issues. My mom offered to take her sister's kids until she got her mental health back in order. My cousins live with their mom now and their mom is in a much better condition mentally.
My dad's uncle died in a boating accident with his cousins. My family let me know he was possibly drowned in the middle of the lake by his cousins because of some money issues. No one was ever prosecuted though, and the family is still very close. Weird.
Please subscribe to Reddit Ramblings for more of the best Reddit stories.